Ridgewood, Vermont, was a town where everyone knew each other's name, and life unfolded at a pace slower than most places in America. Nestled between the dense forests of the Green Mountains, Ridgewood had the charm of a small New England town, with its cobblestone streets and historic buildings. The air was crisp in the spring of 2023, and the colorful array of flowers lining the sidewalks only added to the peaceful atmosphere. But beneath the surface, there were currents stirring that no one could quite see, currents that would soon tear lives apart. The town's heart beat at the corner of Maple Street, where Carter's Treats Bakery stood, a fixture in Ridgewood for over a decade. The small shop with its wide windows and old-fashioned charm was Ethan Carter's domain. At 32, Ethan was known for his quiet nature and meticulous eye for detail. His pastries, delicately decorated cakes, and creamy pies had won the hearts of locals, especially the older women who came in for a sweet treat and stayed for a friendly chat. Ethan had never been one for the spotlight, but his work spoke for itself. His talent was unmatched, and for years, he had worked under the loving guidance of Grace Whitmore, the bakery's previous manager. But things had changed. In April 2023, Grace announced her retirement, and the bakery's owners, looking to expand the business, brought in Marcus Blackwell, a 38-year-old with a reputation for turning struggling businesses around. Marcus was tall, imposing, with sharp eyes that seemed to see through anyone who dared to challenge him. The first time Ethan met him, there was a coldness in Marcus's handshake, a hardness in his smile that made Ethan uneasy. But he didn't think much of it at first. He was a professional, and he had always done his best in his work. However, it didn't take long for the tension to begin. Marcus made it clear from the start that changes were coming, and those changes would not be to Ethan's liking. The bakery, once a haven of creative expression, was now governed by Marcus's rules that demanded strict standards, quotas, and efficiency over artistry. Ethan felt the weight of the new expectations pressing down on him, each day more suffocating than the last. It wasn't just the work that began to change. Ethan's once vibrant spirit began to fade. The joyful, creative energy that had been his trademark in the kitchen started to crumble under the pressure. Marcus's harsh words were a constant sting in the back of his mind. The worst part? He couldn't escape it. He couldn't go home and leave it behind. At the end of each day, he would sit at the kitchen table, staring at his half-finished projects, wondering if he was good enough. Megan, his wife, would often watch him in silence, unsure of how to help him, unsure if she could reach him anymore. Megan, 30, had always been his cheerleader, his high school sweetheart, and the person who had kept his heart warm during the coldest times. But in the last few months, she noticed a change. Ethan, once so filled with quiet ambition and joy, was now a shadow of himself. His once vibrant eyes now looked distant, tired. Their conversations, once easy and full of laughter, now felt strained and awkward. Megan knew something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. All she knew was that her husband was slipping away from her, and she couldn't figure out how to stop it. The changes were subtle at first, small, fleeting moments. Ethan's hands would shake slightly when he worked, and he would apologize profusely when something went wrong, even when it wasn't his fault. He began to isolate himself, avoiding the occasional social gatherings they used to attend. And Megan? She was left alone in the silence of their home, wondering where the man she once knew had gone. Then came the day Marcus Blackwell walked into the bakery, his presence heavy in the air, and everything started to shift. It was a Tuesday, the morning sunlight casting long shadows on the wooden floors. Ethan was putting the finishing touches on a batch of sugar cookies when Marcus stepped in, his eyes immediately scanning the room, looking for something to criticize. "Mornin', Ethan. You still working on these?" Marcus's voice was smooth but carried an edge, a reminder that nothing Ethan did would ever be enough. Ethan's heart sank, his hands freezing mid-movement. This wasn't just a critique, it was another reminder that nothing he did would ever be good enough under Marcus's watch. But this time, there was a flicker in Ethan's mind, a flicker of something darker. He wasn't sure if it was fear, anger, or both, but it was there, lurking. And with that flicker, the tension that had been slowly building would soon explode, setting in motion a chain of events neither Ethan nor Megan could have predicted. Ethan and Megan Carter had once been the epitome of young love in Ridgewood. Their high school romance was the talk of the town, admired for its sweetness and depth. They had grown up together, always by each other's side, and when they married shortly after college, it felt like the beginning of a fairy tale. Ethan had always been quiet, but he was steady, dependable. Megan had been the spark in their relationship, outgoing, passionate, the kind of person who could make anyone feel like they mattered. Their bond had been effortless, built on years of shared memories and understanding. Even their wedding day, small and intimate at the Ridgewood Chapel, was a symbol of their simple, yet profound love. But now, as 2023 unfolded, the cracks in their perfect life started to show. They still loved each other, but the distance between them had grown in ways neither one could explain. The spark Megan once saw in Ethan's eyes had dimmed, replaced by a constant fatigue and an underlying anxiety that Megan couldn't ignore. She tried to brush it off, convincing herself it was just the stresses of life. But she knew deep down that it was something more, something that neither of them had the courage to address. At work, Ethan was crumbling. The once joyful baker was now a man caught in the grip of doubt and fear. Marcus Blackwell's harsh management style had drained him of his passion. The joy Ethan once found in creating intricate designs for cakes and pastries had been replaced by the cold pressure of meeting production quotas. There was no room for creativity, no room for his artistic touch. Every day felt like a battle to keep his head above water. But even as the stress piled on, Ethan couldn't bring himself to confront Marcus or even talk about it with Megan. Megan noticed. She saw the way Ethan's hands would shake as he decorated cakes, his brow furrowed in concentration, his face a mask of quiet frustration. She saw the way he had stopped talking about his day with enthusiasm, how he became more withdrawn, how his smiles no longer reached his eyes. She tried to reassure him, telling him that things would get better, that the stress was just temporary, but it didn't seem to help. Ethan would smile faintly, nod, and return to his work, but she knew better now. She could see it in his eyes, he was struggling in a way that he couldn't, or wouldn't, express. It was in those quiet moments, after a long day, that Megan would look at her husband and wonder who he had become. There was a chasm between them now, one that no amount of conversation or touch seemed to fill. Their once intimate, effortless connection was now strained, forced. She longed for the man she had married, the man who had been so full of life and love. But instead, she was left with a stranger, someone who barely spoke, who barely noticed her. He wasn't the same person. And neither was she. Megan found herself spending more time alone at home, wandering through their house, unable to shake the sense of isolation that had crept in. She told herself that Ethan just needed time to adjust, that he was just overwhelmed by work. But there was something in the air, an unspoken tension between them, that she couldn't ignore. She had tried everything she could think of, small gestures of affection, preparing his favorite meals, even suggesting they go away for a weekend to reconnect. But nothing seemed to make a difference. It was during this time of quiet frustration that Megan began to feel a growing unease, a gnawing feeling deep inside her that something was missing in her life. Ethan had become a shadow of the man she had once known, and she was starting to feel like she was living with a ghost. She tried to bury the feelings of loneliness, telling herself that it was just a phase. But the truth was harder to swallow. Megan was desperate for connection, desperate for someone to see her, to make her feel alive again. That's when Marcus Blackwell entered the picture. Their first real conversation had been at the Maple Brew Café, a cozy little spot in Ridgewood where locals gathered for their morning coffee. Megan had stopped by before work, hoping the quiet would clear her mind. Marcus was already there, sitting alone at a corner table, his sharp eyes scanning the room as he sipped his coffee. Megan hesitated for a moment as she entered the café, but Marcus caught her eye and smiled, an easy, disarming smile that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. He gestured for her to join him, and against her better judgment, Megan found herself walking toward him. The conversation was brief but striking. Marcus was articulate, confident, and passionate about his vision for the bakery. His words were sharp and focused, and Megan found herself hanging on every sentence. She'd always admired Ethan's quiet nature, but in Marcus, she saw something different, a man who exuded power, drive, and charisma. He spoke about business, about how the bakery could grow, about how it could become a landmark in Ridgewood, and as he spoke, Megan felt herself being drawn into his orbit. His words were captivating, and for the first time in months, Megan felt like someone was truly seeing her, not just as Ethan's wife, but as herself. He didn't speak to her with pity or with empty sympathy, he spoke to her with interest and respect. For the first time in a long while, Megan felt like she mattered. When Marcus mentioned Ethan, his tone shifted, becoming more thoughtful. "Ethan is talented, there's no question about that," Marcus said, his gaze sharp and intense. "But he needs to toughen up. The world isn't kind to dreamers, Megan. He's too nice for this business." The words hit Megan harder than she expected. Was Marcus right? Was Ethan too weak to succeed in the world they lived in? For a moment, Megan was torn between loyalty to her husband and the strange, alluring pull of Marcus's confidence. As she left the cafe, Megan felt conflicted. Guilt gnawed at her, but a part of her couldn't deny the attraction she felt toward Marcus, the strength, the conviction, the way he made her feel alive. She tried to push the thoughts aside, but they lingered, simmering beneath the surface, and as the days passed, they only grew stronger. Megan knew she had to face the truth. The life she had with Ethan, the love she once cherished, was slipping through her fingers, and Marcus Blackwell was becoming a dangerous distraction, a distraction that would lead her down a path she never imagined she would take. The days following Marcus Blackwell's arrival at Carter's Treats were filled with subtle, but undeniable shifts. Ethan had spent nearly a decade perfecting his craft at the bakery, his artistry in pastry and cake decorating having earned him the respect and admiration of Ridgewood's tight-knit community. The bakery had been a sanctuary for Ethan, a place where he could pour his creativity and passion into his work. But under Marcus's management, the once warm and collaborative environment began to change, slowly at first, then all at once. The welcoming space Ethan had known now felt suffocating. From the moment Marcus stepped into his new role, he made it clear that things would be different. He had a vision for the bakery, a vision that didn't include the whimsical, detailed cakes Ethan had always prided himself on. Instead, Marcus was focused on one thing: profit. He imposed strict production quotas, standardized designs, and pushed for faster turnarounds. Creativity was replaced with efficiency. The bakery, once a place for artistic expression, became a factory. And Ethan, who had thrived on pushing the boundaries of baking, now found himself confined to a rigid set of rules that stifled his passion. Ethan tried to adjust at first, as he always did, but the pressure was relentless. Marcus's management style was far from nurturing, it was cold, calculating, and demanding. Every time Ethan presented a new idea or suggestion, Marcus shot it down with little regard for the effort Ethan had put into his work. The first real clash came when Ethan proposed a new line of artisanal pastries, delicate, unique creations that he was certain would draw more customers to the bakery. But Marcus dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "Arts and crafts don't pay the bills, Ethan," Marcus said one afternoon, his voice flat, his gaze hard. "We're here to make money, not win awards for your little creations." The words stung. Ethan had always believed that baking was an art form, a way to connect with people, to bring a little joy into their lives. But now, in Marcus's eyes, it was just a transaction. His heart sank as he watched his idea, his passion, crushed under the weight of Marcus's business-first mentality. Over the next few weeks, the tension at Carter's Treats only grew. Ethan became more withdrawn, his confidence shattered. The bakery, once a place of joy, now felt like a battlefield. Every morning, he dreaded stepping into the kitchen. His hands, once steady and sure, now shook slightly as he worked. The pressure to meet Marcus's demands was taking a toll on him, not just physically, but emotionally. He began to question everything, his abilities, his worth, and whether he had it in him to continue in this job that had once been his life's calling. But the most difficult part wasn't the work itself. It was the way Marcus treated him. Ethan's every mistake, every misstep, was met with harsh criticism, often in front of the rest of the staff. It wasn't enough for Marcus to simply correct him, he had to humiliate him. He would hover over Ethan's shoulder, pointing out the smallest flaws in his work, sneering at every imperfection. If Ethan made a mistake decorating a cake or missed a detail, Marcus would bark at him, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Is this what you call a masterpiece, Ethan?" Marcus would say, his tone dripping with disdain. "You're pathetic. We don't have time for your nonsense." Ethan's face would flush with embarrassment, his heart sinking into his chest. He had never been good at confrontation. He was a quiet man, not one to speak up or argue. So, he did what he always did, he withdrew. He didn't argue, didn't stand up for himself. He simply nodded, his gaze cast down at the floor, and tried to push through it. At home, the changes in Ethan were impossible to ignore. Megan watched as the man she married became a shell of himself. The spark that had once burned so brightly in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, lifeless expression. Ethan no longer spoke with the same enthusiasm about his work. He no longer shared his ideas or talked about his dreams. Instead, he came home each evening, exhausted and defeated, often retreating to the couch, staring blankly at the TV as the minutes ticked by. Megan tried to reach out to him, but he was unreachable. She would ask how his day had gone, but the response was always the same, a tired shrug, a muttered "fine," and then silence. She could feel the walls growing between them, walls that she couldn't seem to tear down, no matter how hard she tried. It wasn't just the tension at work that weighed on Ethan, it was the feeling of powerlessness, of being unable to change the course of his own life. His once easygoing nature had been replaced by a constant sense of dread. He began to second-guess every move he made, not just at work, but in life. And as the days turned into weeks, he became a shadow of the man Megan had fallen in love with. The strain in their relationship became more palpable as time passed. Megan, desperate for some connection, found herself frustrated by Ethan's silence, by his unwillingness, or perhaps his inability, to share what he was going through. She encouraged him to speak up, to stand up for himself against Marcus, but Ethan just couldn't bring himself to do it. He feared losing his job, losing the only thing that had been stable in his life for so long. Meanwhile, the tension between Marcus and Ethan continued to escalate. One afternoon, during the busiest time of the year, when the bakery was flooded with orders for Thanksgiving pies, Marcus stormed into the kitchen, his face twisted in anger. Ethan had spent hours perfecting a batch of intricately decorated pies, each adorned with delicate leaf patterns and sugar work. It was his way of showing his creativity, of reclaiming some of the joy he had lost. "What the hell is this, Ethan?" Marcus bellowed, pointing at the pies, his face red with fury. "I told you to stick to the standard designs. We don't have time for your artistic nonsense." Before Ethan could explain, Marcus grabbed one of the pies and slammed it to the floor, smashing it into a pile of broken pastry and frosting. The rest of the employees watched in stunned silence as Marcus berated Ethan, calling him incompetent, threatening to fire him if he didn't fall in line. Ethan stood there, his heart racing, his body trembling with humiliation. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He just stood there, nodding silently, as tears threatened to spill from his eyes. The joy he had once found in baking was gone, replaced by a cold, aching emptiness. The bakery had gone from a place of comfort to a prison, and it seemed like there was no escape. As the months passed, the atmosphere at Carter's Treats grew more toxic, more unbearable. And still, Ethan said nothing. He took the abuse, day after day, until even his own reflection seemed foreign to him. The man he had been, the man Megan had married, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The first time Megan truly spoke with Marcus Blackwell outside of the bakery was in August 2023, when she stumbled into him at Maple Brew Cafe on the corner of Elm and Ridgewood. The cafe had always been a quiet place, perfect for a quick cup of coffee or a peaceful moment alone. Megan often came here before work, hoping the gentle hum of the town's morning bustle would help clear her mind. But that day, as she walked in, her gaze landed on Marcus sitting at a corner table, looking out the window, his dark eyes sharp yet distant. She hesitated, unsure of whether to say hello or quietly leave. But Marcus, as though he had been waiting for her, glanced up at that very moment, his face softening into a smile. It wasn't a smile full of charm or calculated politeness, it was genuine, almost welcoming. Without thinking, Megan found herself walking toward him, as if his presence had a gravitational pull. "Morning, Megan," Marcus greeted, his deep voice warm, yet with an edge that made her feel both curious and uneasy. "I didn't expect to see you here." The way he spoke made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in months. In Ridgewood, people knew everyone's business, and often it felt like she was only ever seen through the lens of Ethan's wife. But Marcus, in that moment, was seeing her, not as a reflection of someone else, but as herself. For reasons she couldn't quite understand, Megan was drawn in. They spent a few minutes chatting, the conversation flowing naturally. Marcus talked about his plans for the bakery, about the challenges he was facing in trying to turn things around. His words were confident, assertive, and filled with a vision of success that Megan couldn't help but admire. As he spoke, she realized how much she missed having someone who was so passionate, so determined. Ethan, in his quiet way, had always been steady, but he had never had that same fire. When Marcus asked about Ethan, his tone shifted slightly, becoming more contemplative. "Ethan's a good guy," he said, "but he's not cut out for this. The bakery needs someone who can push it forward, someone who understands that you have to make tough decisions. But I believe he has potential. It's just that the world isn't kind to dreamers." The words hit Megan harder than she expected. She had always loved Ethan for his quiet, dreamy nature, for his ability to create beautiful things out of nothing. But Marcus's words made her doubt whether Ethan had what it took to succeed in the harsh reality of the world they lived in. Was Marcus right? Was Ethan too soft? Too gentle to navigate the competitive, cutthroat world of business? The conversation lingered in Megan's mind long after she had left the cafe. She found herself replaying every word, every glance, as if she had just experienced something new, something that ignited a spark she hadn't realized had been smoldering inside her. She had always thought she was content with the life she had, with Ethan by her side. But now, the cracks in their marriage were starting to feel more like a chasm, one that no amount of comfort or well-meaning gestures could fill. As the days passed, Marcus's presence in her life grew more frequent. He would stop by the bakery, linger for longer than necessary, asking about her day or offering unsolicited advice about the state of things. Megan was both intrigued and conflicted. She had never been one to entertain thoughts of infidelity, but there was something in Marcus's presence that made her feel alive in ways Ethan no longer did. She found herself sharing more with Marcus than she had with Ethan in months, her frustrations, her fears, and, most significantly, her sense of isolation. Each time they met, their connection grew deeper. At first, it was innocent, a shared laugh here, a lingering glance there. But soon, Megan found herself looking forward to their encounters. She would justify it to herself, convincing herself that she was only trying to understand Marcus, that it was harmless. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Marcus had become a source of validation, a way to escape the growing discontent in her marriage. Then came the night she couldn't shake. It was late, around 9 p.m., and Megan had stayed late at school to prepare for an upcoming parent-teacher conference. As she stepped outside, she was surprised to see Marcus standing near his sleek black car, as though he had been waiting for her. His eyes locked with hers the moment she stepped out, and he smiled that same disarming smile that always seemed to make her heart race. "I was just driving by," Marcus said, his voice smooth, "and I saw you leaving. Thought I'd offer you a ride home." Megan hesitated, the voice of reason whispering in her ear that this wasn't appropriate. She shouldn't get in the car. But the curiosity, the desire to feel wanted, seen, overpowered her better judgment. With a slight nod, she slid into the passenger seat, her heart pounding in her chest. The ride to her house was short, but the air between them felt charged. The soft leather seats and the spicy scent of Marcus's cologne filled the car, making Megan's senses come alive in a way she hadn't felt in months. They didn't talk much, but there was something electric in the silence, a shared understanding that neither one of them wanted to acknowledge. Marcus suggested they stop at a bar in the next town over, a quieter spot where they wouldn't be recognized. Megan hesitated but agreed, her mind racing with the consequences of her actions. As they sipped their drinks, Marcus was attentive, asking her questions about her life, her dreams. For the first time in a long while, Megan felt like someone truly cared about her thoughts and feelings. It was intoxicating, almost overwhelming. Their conversation flowed easily, and before she knew it, Marcus leaned in. Megan's heart raced as he whispered something she couldn't quite make out, but it didn't matter. The space between them closed, and their lips met in a kiss that was slow, deliberate, full of a longing that Megan had never expected to feel. For a moment, she didn't care about the consequences. She didn't care about Ethan, or the life they had built. She only cared about the thrill of the moment, the thrill of finally being wanted in a way that was more than just being a wife. The kiss ended, but the feeling lingered, leaving Megan breathless and filled with a sense of confusion. She pulled away, her mind racing with guilt, but Marcus just smiled, his eyes holding a hint of something more. "It's okay, Megan," he whispered, his hand brushing against hers. "I understand." But Megan wasn't sure she understood anything anymore. As the days passed, Marcus's pull on her grew stronger. She justified each meeting, each conversation, each moment of contact. But deep down, she knew she was walking a dangerous line, one that could shatter everything, her marriage, her life, and everything she thought she believed in. And yet, she couldn't seem to stop herself. As the weeks went by, the tension between Megan and Marcus only deepened, and the cracks in her marriage widened further. The guilt that Megan initially felt after her encounter with Marcus soon turned into something more dangerous, obsession. She couldn't shake the pull she felt toward him, and the constant flutter in her chest whenever he was near. Every meeting, every conversation, was a moment of escape from the responsibilities of her life, from the growing distance between her and Ethan, from the quiet, unspoken despair she had felt for months. At home, Ethan remained the same, distant, withdrawn, lost in his own thoughts. The weight of his unhappiness was palpable, and Megan felt it pressing down on her every day. His tired eyes, his quiet demeanor, and his inability to stand up for himself made her feel both frustrated and guilty. She tried to talk to him, tried to encourage him to confront Marcus, but every time she did, Ethan just shrugged it off, offering a weak excuse for his behavior. "Maybe I just need to work harder, Rachel," he would say, his voice lacking conviction. "Maybe Marcus is right. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this." Megan's heart broke each time he spoke like that. She knew that he was broken, his spirit had been crushed by Marcus's harsh treatment, but what hurt the most was the fact that he seemed willing to accept it. He didn't fight for himself, and he certainly didn't fight for their marriage. It was as though he had resigned himself to this new version of their life, this version where he was constantly under pressure and constantly failing. And the more he withdrew, the more Megan found herself reaching for Marcus. Their secret meetings became more frequent. After work, Marcus would show up at the bakery just before closing, lingering longer than necessary. Megan would make excuses to stay late, telling Ethan she had a few things to finish up. The air in the bakery grew heavy with unspoken words, and the tension between Marcus and Megan was unmistakable. They would exchange glances, each one more charged than the last. Their stolen moments, those brief, fleeting interactions, were like a drug to Megan. And yet, with each passing day, the guilt gnawed at her, threatening to pull her under. Then, one fateful afternoon, the cracks that had been forming in Ethan and Megan's relationship suddenly shattered. Ethan, feeling the growing distance between them, began to investigate. His suspicions had been building for some time. He had noticed Megan's late nights, the way she would quickly cover up her phone whenever he walked into the room. His mind, once clouded by doubt and anxiety, was now sharp and focused. The moment of realization came when he heard a whisper of conversation from a colleague. Caleb Harper, a co-worker who had always kept to himself, approached Ethan one quiet afternoon at the bakery, his expression uneasy. "Ethan," Caleb said hesitantly, his voice low, "I don't want to cause any trouble, but I saw something the other day. Something I think you should know about." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He could feel his blood run cold as Caleb continued, "I saw Rachel getting into Marcus's car a few days ago. They were talking, and it didn't seem like a casual conversation, if you know what I mean." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He felt his stomach tighten, his vision blur, as his worst fears began to come true. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe Marcus was just giving Megan a ride, maybe there was an innocent explanation, but deep down, Ethan knew. He knew that something had been going on between his wife and the man who had slowly taken over his life and his bakery. Days passed in a blur of confusion and anger as Ethan tried to process what he had learned. The quiet, gentle man he had been was slipping away, replaced by someone else, someone desperate to confront the truth. His suspicions were confirmed when he noticed Megan's behavior becoming even more erratic. She had been distant for weeks, but now there was something else in her eyes, a guilt, a fear that Ethan couldn't ignore. The weight of it all became unbearable. The anger that had been simmering inside him began to bubble to the surface. And that's when the second twist came, one that Ethan never could have predicted. One evening, as the sun began to set over Ridgewood, Ethan decided it was time to confront Megan. He had waited long enough, lived in silence long enough. He had to know the truth. He had to face whatever had been tearing apart the life they had built together. When Megan returned home from the bakery, he was waiting for her, his jaw clenched, his fists trembling with emotion. "Megan," Ethan said, his voice cold but filled with a quiet intensity, "is it true?" Megan froze, her eyes widening with shock. She could see the storm brewing in Ethan's eyes, the hurt, the betrayal, the pain. For a moment, the world around her seemed to fall away, leaving only the weight of what she had done. Ethan stepped closer, his voice breaking. "Are you having an affair with Marcus?" For a long, excruciating moment, Megan stood in silence, her eyes filling with tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. The guilt was suffocating, and she knew she couldn't hide the truth any longer. "Yes," she whispered, the admission falling from her lips like a heavy stone. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan staggered back, his world crumbling around him. The woman he had loved, the woman he had stood beside through everything, had betrayed him. And worse, it had been with Marcus, the very man who had been slowly destroying everything Ethan held dear. I never meant for this to happen," Megan said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to hurt you, Ethan. But Marcus made me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in months. I needed something. I needed to feel seen." Ethan's face twisted with a mix of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. "So, you needed him, Megan? You needed him more than me?" The weight of her guilt was suffocating. She reached out to him, but Ethan recoiled, his expression unreadable. "I don't know who you are anymore," he muttered, the pain in his voice raw and jagged. Megan's world shattered as she realized the full extent of her actions. She had lost Ethan, the man who had been her partner, her confidant, her love, and now, everything seemed out of reach. She had torn apart the one thing that had mattered most to her, and for what? A fleeting escape into something she could never control. But the storm was far from over. Ethan's resolve hardened, and his mind raced with a single thought: Marcus had to pay for this. He would make sure of it. And as the sun set over Ridgewood, casting long shadows across the town, Ethan's fate, and Megan's, was sealed. The days following the confrontation between Ethan and Megan were suffused with a cold, suffocating silence. The air in their house felt heavy, like a storm that had yet to break. Ethan was no longer the quiet, self-doubting man he had once been. The revelation of his wife's betrayal had ignited something within him, something darker, something that burned with the intensity of his anger, hurt, and humiliation. He had always been a man who avoided confrontation, who shrank from conflict. But now, that part of him seemed to have died with the truth. He no longer felt like a victim of Marcus's bullying or Megan's indifference. The truth, however painful, had fueled a fire inside him that could no longer be extinguished. He was done being passive. Megan, for her part, was consumed by guilt. She hadn't expected Ethan to find out, not like this, and certainly not so soon. She had hoped for some kind of resolution, that maybe their marriage could survive the affair, that time would heal the wounds. But as she watched Ethan retreat further into himself, she knew deep down that they were beyond repair. The chasm between them was too wide now, and no apology could bridge it. She spent her days in a haze of regret and confusion, replaying every decision that had led her to this point. She had justified her actions at first, convinced herself that her needs had been ignored, that Marcus had simply been an escape from a life that felt increasingly empty. But now, standing in the aftermath, she saw just how much destruction she had caused. Her marriage, her integrity, and her own sense of self had been shattered. Ethan's transformation was complete. Where once he had been hesitant, a man of few words and even fewer actions, now he was someone driven by a singular need: revenge. He couldn't let Marcus get away with what he had done, not just to his career, but to his marriage, to his life. The more he thought about it, the more he stewed in his own fury, the more convinced he became that Marcus needed to pay for his betrayal. It was late on a Wednesday evening in November when the final confrontation took place. The last of the autumn leaves had fallen, leaving the trees bare and stark against the cold evening sky. Ridgewood, usually so quiet and peaceful, seemed to hold its breath as Ethan made his decision. He had waited long enough. He had endured enough. The time had come to end this, one way or another. Megan had left for a late meeting at school, leaving Ethan alone at home. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the ticking of the kitchen clock. Ethan paced the floor, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His mind raced, his thoughts a blur of anger, betrayal, and fear. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Marcus continue to destroy him, to destroy everything he had worked for. Without a second thought, Ethan grabbed his car keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The drive to Carter's Treats was a blur. His mind was consumed by the images of Marcus, his smug face, the way he had belittled Ethan day after day, the way he had stolen everything Ethan held dear. The bakery's lights were still on when Ethan pulled into the parking lot. Marcus was always a late worker, staying long after the rest of the staff had left. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at his skin. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second-guess himself. He stormed into the bakery, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor, echoing through the otherwise empty shop. Inside, Marcus was finishing up, wiping down the counter as he prepared to close for the night. He didn't hear Ethan approach until the bell above the door rang as it swung open. Marcus looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes for just a moment. "Ethan," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "What are you doing here?" Ethan didn't answer. He simply marched up to Marcus, his chest heaving with rage. The years of frustration, of being pushed around, of watching his life crumble, everything came to a head in that moment. "You ruined my life," Ethan said, his voice low and threatening. Marcus raised an eyebrow, taking a step back. "Come on, Ethan. You've been blaming me for everything, but you're the one who let it all slip away. You're the one who's weak." The words hit Ethan like a slap in the face, but they only fueled his anger. He couldn't think, couldn't process. All he could feel was the red-hot burn of betrayal. Without warning, Ethan lunged at Marcus, his fist connecting with Marcus's jaw with a sickening thud. Marcus staggered back, surprised by the force of the blow, but quickly regained his footing. "Is this what you want, Ethan?" he sneered, wiping blood from his lip. "You think this will make it better?" Ethan didn't respond. The anger and frustration that had been building for months erupted within him. He lunged again, this time grabbing a heavy rolling pin from the nearby workstation. Marcus tried to defend himself, but Ethan was faster, his hand gripping the pin with a primal desperation. The rolling pin connected with Marcus's temple, and for a moment, everything froze. Marcus stumbled backward, his hands flying up to his head in an attempt to steady himself, but it was too late. He collapsed onto the floor with a sickening thud, blood pooling around his head. Ethan stood over him, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands trembling as he dropped the rolling pin to the floor. What had he done? What had he become? For a long moment, Ethan stood there, staring down at Marcus's lifeless body. His mind was a blur, his emotions a storm of disbelief and horror. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. In that instant, Ethan realized that everything he had been running from, everything he had feared, had culminated in this single act of violence. His life, his marriage, his future, all of it was gone now. He knelt beside Marcus, checking for a pulse. There was none. The man who had destroyed his life, who had stolen his wife and shattered his spirit, was gone. Panic set in. Ethan's heart raced as reality sank in. The bakery that had once been his sanctuary was now the scene of his own destruction. He knew he couldn't stay. He couldn't undo what had been done. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his voice barely a whisper. "I've killed someone," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "Please, send help." As he waited for the police to arrive, Ethan sank to the floor, his back against the counter, his eyes empty. The sirens grew louder in the distance, but they felt like the sound of his world crumbling into oblivion. And in that moment, Ethan understood, there was no going back. The quiet hum of sirens filled the air as Ethan sat frozen on the cold floor of Carter's Treats, his back pressed against the counter, staring at the lifeless body of Marcus Blackwell. The bakery, once a place where he poured his heart into each pastry, each cake, was now the scene of unimaginable tragedy. His hands trembled, his mind clouded with a mix of guilt, fear, and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had his life unraveled so completely, so suddenly? The flashing lights outside the bakery cut through the darkness like a beacon, signaling the end of his freedom, the end of everything he had known. He had killed Marcus, the man who had stolen his joy, his confidence, and, most painfully, his wife. The weight of his actions hit him like a ton of bricks, but even as he sat there, knowing what would come next, he couldn't stop himself from wondering if it had all been worth it. The police arrived moments later, their footsteps echoing through the bakery as they rushed to secure the scene. Ethan's body felt numb, as though he had been disconnected from his own actions. They didn't ask him to move. They didn't need to. He knew what he had done. There was no escape from this. "Mr. Carter," one of the officers said, his voice calm but stern as he approached Ethan, "we need you to come with us. "You're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Blackwell." Ethan nodded silently. There was nothing left to say. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, but he couldn't summon the words to express them. What could he possibly say? That he had acted out of rage? That he had been pushed too far by Marcus's cruel behavior? It didn't matter. None of it mattered now. What mattered was the man lying dead on the floor and the irreversible decision Ethan had made in the heat of the moment. As the officers placed him in handcuffs, Ethan glanced one last time at Marcus's body, his chest tightening. He had always been a man of few words, a man who avoided conflict, who took the punches and kept going. But tonight, in his desperation, he had finally broken. And now, he would face the consequences. The next days were a blur. Ethan was taken to the police station, where he was booked and interrogated. The town of Ridgewood, once so peaceful and quaint, now buzzed with shock and morbid curiosity. News of the murder spread like wildfire, with whispers of betrayal and anger fueling the frenzy. The locals, who had once admired Ethan for his quiet, kind nature, now saw him through the lens of the tragic events that had unfolded. The bakery was closed, its windows boarded up, as the community struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Megan, devastated by the loss of both her husband and the man she had betrayed him for, was left to pick up the pieces of a life she had destroyed. She had watched Ethan change before her eyes, had seen him become someone she barely recognized, but nothing had prepared her for the nightmare that would follow. The weight of her own guilt pressed down on her with a suffocating force. She had lost everything, her marriage, her self-respect, and now, the man she had once loved. She tried to reach Ethan, but it was too late. The man she had betrayed was gone, and so was her future. As Ethan awaited trial, he was forced to confront the reality of his actions. The anger that had driven him to murder had subsided, leaving only the heavy burden of regret. He couldn't change what had happened, couldn't undo the damage he had caused. All he could do was face the consequences and try to make sense of a life that had spiraled out of control. The trial, when it came, was swift. The town of Ridgewood was divided. Some saw Ethan as a victim, an ordinary man driven to a breaking point by years of abuse from his boss and the betrayal of his wife. Others condemned him as a murderer, arguing that nothing could justify the taking of a life, no matter the circumstances. In the end, the jury found him guilty of manslaughter, a lesser charge than the second-degree murder that the prosecution had sought. The judge, taking into account Ethan's lack of prior criminal history and the emotional and psychological toll he had endured, sentenced him to 15 years in prison. As Ethan was led away in handcuffs, his face impassive, he caught a glimpse of Megan in the courtroom. She sat in the gallery, her face pale and etched with grief. The two locked eyes for a brief moment, but there was nothing left to say. The life they had once known was gone, and neither of them knew how to pick up the pieces. Ethan would serve his sentence, but the years would not heal the wounds left by that fateful night. For Megan, the road ahead would be long and lonely, marked by regret and a constant sense of loss. The town of Ridgewood, once a place of simple joys, would never be the same again. It had been forever changed by one tragic act of violence, and the lives of everyone involved had been irreparably altered. What do you think of this story? Do you think Ethan's actions were justified, given everything he went through? Or was there another way he could have handled the situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your perspective on this heartbreaking story. Don't forget to like and share the video, and if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button for more true crime stories.